I do qualitative research. I have done work on using ethnography, mostly when I was younger. And I do interviews, which are a little bit more family friendly and more flexible. And so as you'll hear, I really think that the best ethnographic research is done by young people. Those are the best books that really come out because young people have the fire in the belly. They have lots of time, usually, even though many have constraints. So I really think that there's a lot of very important work going on in ethnographies. And yet I also think young people face many moments of doubt and many moments of uncertainty, in part because, as I'm going to talk about today, qualitative research is emergent, which means that realistically, you don't always know what you're doing when you're doing it. And in that regard, experience does not help. I'm wrapping up data collection on interviews with people who, for the most part, have more than $10 million in the US, which is, I would not say that the experience helped in the sense that I had moments of confusion and anguish and uncertainty, and also I had to make many hard choices. And so it's the issue of hard choices, especially, that I want to talk about today. Some of you may use quantitative methods, and all of us read quantitative research. And I think in graduate training, at least in the US, I think quantitative research is the dominant training. And I really think that what I would call the scientific method is very different in terms of logics with qualitative research. And so here, these are the steps involved. I think most people would agree involved in this quantitative research. And I mean, there are certainly adjustments and people make decisions that people have a nonlinear distribution. It can create all kinds of havoc in a data set, et cetera. But qualitative research has a different process. And that's really, I think, you take a step, you gather information, and then you adjust. You take another step, and then you adjust again. And so it's emergent. And also there's an issue of analyzing, trying to figure out what you're doing, and making hard choices when you're in the middle of data collection. And so it's a process. And so I really think that I have strong opinions about these things. I wrote a book called Listening to People, which has lots of advice. And I think there are points when things should come into focus. But I don't think a lot of the questions that qualitative researchers are asked are necessarily that helpful. And so some people are asked about how do you know that this is typical? And the answer is you just really often don't know. And you depend on other studies to help you. But I think the idea is to make a conceptual contribution. And so if you're doing, like essentially a regression model, you're adding a new line of analysis, you're unpacking a mechanism, and you're trying to add something that has not been there before. And so today I want to sort of talk about three different points. One is the hard choices in design. One is about hard choices in data collection, and also especially about writing and trying to make sure that your claims match the data exactly. And here I do think there's a difference between expectations in the United States compared to expectations in the UK and Europe. And so when people try to publish in the US journals, I think sometimes they can hit a set of barriers because the taken for granted expectations, I think, are different, which I want to talk about. And then there's a process of gathering your focus as you go along. And so, as I say, I have this book, Listening to People, which focuses both on interviewing and observation. It's intended to be a deeply practical guide, a reference guide that people could have in their libraries and have at home and pick up when they get discouraged or unclear and kind of look at. So I do think it's important to dream about what you'd like to do. And yet one study cannot do everything. And so I want to talk about what to worry about and what not to worry about. But I think in the US, there is more effort to be systematic in qualitative work. And the samples are somewhat larger. I think it is hard to get published in US journals with fewer than, say, 30 people if you're interviewing. People at Harvard tend to often have like what I consider to be extremely large samples. And listening to people, I go to the wall to defend dissertations and book projects based on 50 interviews. If you have observations, ideally, say my favorite design is often 9 months of observations and then embedded interviews with people who you've run across. And then you can talk to them about what you saw and what you did together. There's a lot of concern in the US, and I remain concerned about what we would call cells and heterogeneity within the cell. And so I think I make a big emphasis on making hard choices. So I work to say limit systematically a study which either limits or systematically compares class. So a lot of my studies have had Unequal Childhoods, which is a book on child rearing, had middle-class families, working class and poor families. There was a fair amount of heterogeneity in the middle class, included middle class and upper middle class people. And that was partly because the community where I was first at in the Midwest had a lot of poor families. And that's kind of how I stumbled into this sample. We would either limit or systematically compare on race and ethnicity. So my current study has 88 families, and it has white families, African American families, and South Asian Indian American families. It's extremely hard to recruit people with more than $10 million. And usually I would ask everybody I knew except for students or in-laws if they knew anybody. And often people knew one person. A lot of people didn't know anybody, but a lot of people my colleagues and other people knew one person. I didn't go to people at Penn, University of Pennsylvania. I went out. And then I said, okay, great. Next time you talk to the person, ideally face-to-face before the pandemic, maybe you could see, would they be okay talking to me on the phone for 10 or 15 minutes and passing along, you would pass along their contact information to me. And I would reach out, we'd talk for 10 or 15 minutes. By agreeing to talk to me, they were not agreeing to be in the study, but only to learn more about it. And in the book, I talk a little bit about a little ask, not a big ask. Because if you ask people for an interview, often they'll say, no, I'm too busy. But if you ask them for a 10-minute phone call, that's a much more manageable request. And then if you can talk to them on the phone, then sometimes you'll make progress. In my study of wealthy people, it looked, by the way, that it was about 20% of the people who were asked agreed to talk to me. It's a little low, but in my defense, it's higher than the Survey of Consumer Finance, which is the definitive survey in the United States, which is 15% for high net worth individuals. It was much easier to recruit middle-class moms. It was just, they would snowball. These people, I just couldn't get people to snowball. And other people have that experience too. So the point is, I'm only studying people who are essentially members of the upper class. I am staying away from Chinese and Korean American people. Even if I was offered somebody, I would decline. Because I want to have a sufficient number of people in each category. So I have 8 Indian Americans. I'm sweating this a little bit. It seems a little low. But I feel like they're very consistent in what they're telling me. They're all giving remittances to their families. All of them were born in India, and they all moved to the US. They're all US citizens. And they all have their family come stay for 2 or 3 months. So it's pretty consistent. So I'm going to go with that, But the point is, I make hard choices, and that means turning away from people as well as turning towards people. And same thing. So I limit or I systematically compare on the key issues. That means sometimes you have to make, you can't do this all of them, or you just wouldn't have a study. And so neighborhood, I let go of people are employed or retired or let go of. Some things I've just go, that's not crucial to the study. So I do think it's important to begin by dreaming. Even if people tell you it's crazy, I don't, I would do it 4 or 5 times before I gave up. When I started Unequal Childhoods, which was before reality TV, a lot of people told me that families would never agree and it was impossible to do the study. And they were wrong. It was possible. I have a graduate, Blair Sackett, who she and I authored a book together, which just came out last year. We're very excited about it. We thought it would be heaven. She wanted to do a dissertation in a refugee camp and people said it couldn't be done. She did not know a single person in a refugee camp. She was in Philadelphia, the refugee camp was in Kenya. It's like, yikes. But she did it. She got there. And it was true, the strength of weak ties. And she has a very good article about ghosting, being ghosted in qualitative work, which is coming out. So the point is, I think, to really think about what you'd like to do and not give up. But then immediately you have to make hard choices. And I think it's better to do a study which is close to home, even if there's a better research site further away. Even if there's a better school further away, I would take the school close to home. Because, you have to go there, you have to go back, you have to write field notes. I think you want to limit your comparison, and then you have to think deeply about participation. I think when you're young, doing a participant observation study is an excellent idea. And, I just think you learn a lot from observations. And to be sure, interviews are valuable. I'm doing an interview study right now, but I think that there's something special about ethnography. And so then you have to make hard choices. Who will you study? Why will you study them? How you get in? I think it's very important to use the strength of weak ties, including faculty and graduate student and other people in the academic community, to get into a site. It's more successful, and having somebody vouch for you is more successful. But I'm not a fan of people working in a site and having work friends and then showing up one day and saying, hi, I'm going to do a study. Because to me, you've built relationships with people already and they became friends with you on that basis. And maybe they wouldn't be friends with you if they knew you were going to do a study. So I think it's better for you to go to a new site. Maybe they could help you get into another site. There's a very vigorous argument in the US going on about insider, outsider, particularly around issues of race. I believe that insiders have special advantages and I believe outsiders have special advantages. I believe it's legitimate for outsiders to study people of different races, different genders, different sexuality. Don't think we should say only gay men can study gay men. But I think that there are costs and benefits to each approach. And so when people sort of sometimes angrily attack you for doing one or the other, I think all you can say is the same thing each time, which is that insiders have advantages and outsiders have advantages. And you had this perspective, but there were other things surely you missed because of it. And I wouldn't worry about it because you can't change it. And I would be very respectful of other positions. In terms of the hard choices with the size, I think small is better. I think 50 is a lot for a dissertation, for a master's project, maybe, 15 or 20, I don't know. But everything compounds. You have to transcribe the interview. About a quarter of interviews cancel. You have to read, you have to write, you have to code. Focus is on meaning. The focus is not on making claims about the number of people you studied. So small is good. And also it compounds very quickly. Here is a hypothetical study, say of families and schools. A lot of my early research was on families and schools. And you just see how if you go from 7 to 11, I like to have at least 7, 8 people, because some people might be really unusual. And I don't know, I like to see and you can usually see patterns that are pretty clear in, I think, groups of 8 to 11. So you can see the difference between 42 and 66 is a really big difference. And so everything compounds, right? But you have to make hard choices. This is a study where I'm dividing upper middle class and lower middle class. I did a study called Choosing Homes, Choosing Schools. And Elliot Weiniger and I was my collaborator, worked very hard to get upper middle class and lower middle class families. And then we couldn't see any difference in the patterns. So we combined them. But we were very assiduous in our day, and we defined upper middle class as having a graduate degree and a professional job and a high level of autonomy compared to a lower middle class where they have more limited occupational conditions. When I was doing this book, Unequal Childhoods, I did these interviews, and then I wanted to do these observations, mostly because I was dissatisfied with the interviews. So a lot of this came through failure. I was interviewing people, they were running around like crazy, these middle-class families. They had rainouts, they had soccer, what you call football games. And I would say, tell me about how this happened. They said, well, he brought home a form. And so I said, okay. You can't have dinner together. Yes. Why are people doing this? I just felt like the interview. And then I tend to be a little bit impatient. I interview a lot of parents and they say, I just want him to be happy. He can do anything he wants. And I'm like, shoot me now. Like, what am I to learn from this? So it was partly because I felt like I wasn't learning what I wanted to learn that I thought I would start following people around. I was very anxious about it. And I was still in the Midwest, and there was this family, and with a lot of trepidation, I asked them if I could follow them around. I just did it once, actually. And they had a 12-year-old daughter and this 10-year-old kid. And the 12-year-old daughter just had a fit. And she was yelling at her brother for being a slowpoke, and he was making her late, and he was so stupid, and what was he doing? And, on and on and on. They were going to swimming, so she was in the front seat and I was in the back seat, and the brother was just kind of, ignoring her and not engaging with her. And she was like, and so we took him to swimming, took her to swimming, dropped her off, and we went to the baseball game. And then the mother came, and the father went and got his mother and brought her to the baseball game. And then we all watched the baseball game, and then the father left and went to swimming and picked up the daughter and took her home. And then the baseball game ended, and he took the mother home, and then all of us went out to dinner, which was a complete disaster because it was all very awkward and strange. And then it turned out she had forgotten her swimsuit, so she couldn't even swim, right? Because she was so busy ragging on her brother. And so it was just one visit, but it just looked like it was going to be okay. It wasn't perfect. It was having an impact, but some aspects of family life you could observe. And so that's what gave me the more confidence to proceed. So I sort of started, at first I had two families, and I had, then we did one family at a time, and I had research assistants, and one person went 3 or 4 days a week, and I went once or twice a week, and somebody else went once or twice a week. So we went continuously 7 days a week. Except unless I was the lead field worker, who I was with the white poor family, who was one of the earliest families in the white middle class family. And we learned that it was better to go every day. This was before cell phones, and it just worked better. They got used to us, we got used to them. The whole thing was just better. So I had done these middle class families too. And I was trying to find an African-American family. I was in a predominantly, and I'd done 6 months of observation in 2 schools, right? A city school and a suburban school. I went to a suburban school that was predominantly white, but was about 10% racially diverse, mostly African-American. That meant there were 3 kids in each 3rd grade or 4th grade who were Black families. I persuaded the families to do a 2-hour interview. I could not persuade the families to be in the observational study. I tripled the honorarium from, it's in today's dollars, 550 to what would be 1,500. It was an invasion of privacy. Which it was. And there was a Black middle class mom who was a single mom who I was pretty sure would have agreed. But I had sunk costs with 2 white middle class people. I didn't want to have 4 families where the white families were 2-parent and the Black families were single parent. Right? So I walked away. So I had spent a year of observation in 2 schools. This was a school-based study. I had done family observations of parent-teacher conferences. I'd gone in these schools 3 times a week. Right? The whole study was organized around schools. And this was like a complete disaster in my view. But I was unwilling to compromise on this point. And I think it was a good decision. I mean, it had a happy ending, the book did fine, but it also was terrible when it was happening because I wouldn't have done it that way, you know. And so sometimes you just have to make hard choices in the middle. And so, but you can see that this is not just, sorry, this was the design for the study. This is not just like a theoretical idea of making hard choices. It means sometimes really making hard decisions. So in addition to the design issues, in the US, I think I'm a big fan of rich, deep data. In the question and answer period, we can, and in the book I have like an interview that I think is sort of a so-so interview. And then I have an interview, which I think is a better interview in the book. The same thing with field notes, sort of mediocre field notes and excellent field notes. And I think a lot of it has to do with richness and detail. And so, but to be sure, in the American Sociological Review, which is one of the leading journals, they accept papers of 15,000 words. That's twice the expectation of papers in the UK for the most part. So there are just differences in how much, if you have a paper of 15,000 words, you can just have more data. So I think that's an issue. But I think the US also, there's a little bit, I think, of difference in expectations of precision around claims. Now, to be sure, a lot of the work in the UK is very theoretical. It's very theoretical and informed, which I really admire. So there's a lot of work in the US that's a little bit just more atheoretical, empirical presentations of data, But I think this issue of claims has to do with when you have a quote or a field note, what you do with it. And I think there's a common problem where people just expect the quotes to speak for themselves. And the interpretation, but by definition of by selecting a quote, you're making an analytic decision. And so as much as help as possible, I think it's extremely helpful to show the reader how you see the quote supporting your point and how that connects to your overall thesis in the paper. And this is hard to do. I'm going to skip this slide. So I'm going to give you an example here from a paper that I did with Vanessa Lopes-Munoz that came out a while ago. And this was, there's a million studies of parent involvement in schooling, and a lot of them say, we need to be partners. Families and schools need to work together as partners. And I have to say, I spent a lot of my career kind of arguing against this point, since I think it underestimates very vigorous clashes that happen between families and schools. So in this case, this was a study of an upper middle class, very elite destination school district in the US where people moved because it was allegedly one of the best school districts. And in the paper, you can see from the table, the title, you're not going to call the shots. This is the principal saying, you're not going to run the school, I'm running the school, right? And so there was a lot of conflict between these very involved moms and the principal. And so in this moment in the paper, we say the parents, what they wanted the school to be more personal, be flexible, be fun. They wanted to be less bureaucratic. And here's a quote from a mom about, saying that lunchtime, they can only talk whisper, that lunch is so unfun. She says she's mad about it. And so as authors, we had a choice. We could have just repeated the point, which is parents complained that lunch was unfun. But that summarizes the quote that everyone just read, the reader just read, and it doesn't advance the argument. So instead, I think very briefly, we want to remind the reader of our criticism in the literature, And our criticism is that scholars have overstated the harmony between parents and educators. And then we want to state our key point about their different priorities. So this is just to refresh your memories about what the quote is again that you've just seen. And now, so we wrote this here. We said, researchers on parent involvement have assumed that parents and educators will be able to work in harmony. Then while we found they shared the same generalized goal, they had different ideas about how to prioritize the needs of the children. They had different priorities. Right? So to make it more plain, the first sentence reviews the literature in one sentence and highlights how the literature is problematic in our views. The second sentence shows how we're trying to make a claim that's not sufficiently emphasized in the literature. And the third makes our claim definitively clear. So this is a process that we more or less repeat with most, not just at the beginning and the end, but in the middle of the paper, almost with every quote. And then that way you're sort of threading through the paper and building an argument. One way to think about it is that each paragraph advances the argument that you're trying to make. And so the analysis is woven around the data. And it's like Goldilocks, right? It's not too strong, doesn't go beyond it. It's not too weak, or it doesn't make a point. It's not repetitive. The ideas are stated before the quote. In other words, the idea comes before the quote. It's not like a mystery where it comes at the end. And the data does not speak for itself, and the reader is being guided. So in this analysis process, I think that's how articles, at least for me, become more interesting, because they help the reader show what's new from the data. And that's very hard to do. I'm in the middle of data, I'm still collecting data. And it's like, I don't know what's new. And, having other people who I can talk to is very helpful, and trying to figure out my thesis. And so I think it's important to have reasonable expectations, which is that qualitative researchers generally do not know what they're doing at first. And as I'll have to talk about in a second, you have to act like you know what you're doing, right? You have a dissertation proposal defense, you apply for money, you have hearings, and in all of those, you have to say, this is going to be a great study, I'm going to do this study, you have no idea what you're doing. And so I think it's very common that people have trouble articulating a reasonable thesis, and often are confused, incoherent, and lost. And I do not think experience helps. And so I think that means it's easy. I think if we know this is going to happen, then we can all be kind of prepared for it. And if faculty and mentors know it's going to happen, it's good, it's good not to panic. But on the other hand, you don't want to be lost at the very end. And at some point in this journey of data collection, you want to kind of figure out what you're doing. So it's, I think that's the challenge here. And so I think this issue of a lot of depth of data, and then with the data, using it to show a point, is sort of a really important part of qualitative research. And that means making hard choices. By going down one path, you're not going down another. And that's hard. It's really hard. Although at the beginning of a study, you think the study is going to be great, it's going to do all these things. And so you have to manage. I know somebody who never finished his dissertation. And I think that this person who was a perfectionist couldn't deal with loss, couldn't deal with the fact that this book had a beginning, middle, and end. It was not going to be perfect. And if you can't deal with that, you can't finish things, And so I think this issue of having reasonable expectations. So in addition to hard choices in data collection and hard choices in the analysis and in the writing, I think finding a focus is a really important challenge. And so I see data analysis as happening entirely through the process. Now, do I always follow this and do this exactly right? No. I mean, did I do 4 interviews in a week last December? Yes. Did I have time to reflect on it? No. So, what can I say? But I think the point is that you want to do some interviews, stop what you're doing, take stock and make some decisions, and then focus and go forward. So this is about answering the so what question, which reviewers really care about. You know, why do we need this study? I think you can presume mostly the reviewers have read your paper, have read all the literature you've read. So you don't need to belabor it. So that you're trying to make an argument in the literature review showing the need for this study. So one way to think about this is that this is a journey from a research topic to a research question. And a research focus is a subject. So it's an area of investigation. You're studying women in prison, you're studying the homeless, you're studying children's activities, you're studying racial discrimination by police. Those are a subject or a topic. But those are not research questions. A research question asks the question where there are competing answers and you don't know the answer to the question ahead of time. So, you know, how does a lot of research has looked at material factors among the wealthy, the wealth distribution. I'm interested sort of in cultural logics and how families manage wealth in their families. And, you know, there's not a lot of research on the family. A lot of it's on the individuals. It's not on the family, like if there are 4 sisters, how they manage it, and sort of the cultural management of this, of the issue of being very wealthy. And so, so this research question then needs to be refined over time. And one way to think about is to think about a concept you admire. You know, I've been, you know, work of Pierre Bourdieu is super interesting and very helpful. And then, so what's the concept that's guiding your data analysis and data collection? What's the limitations on the literature? What are the concepts you find exciting and interesting? And what are you trying to figure out what you're doing? Right? So it's a process. So there are lots of different ways to think. You know, here's one is taking a blank paper and writing down all the possible research questions and then grouping them by color. Talking to a friend about what you're seeing, writing about in a journal about key themes, reading an article and then writing a memo about how your work is different than that work, and doing anything that's in the past and helped you in the past to think through a problem. So to give you an example here, there was this young man who was applying to go to graduate school, and now he's actually in graduate school, though Rob Lyons is not his real name. And he was doing, he was taking a class with me and doing qualitative study. And he was interested in pets. And, you know, Unequal Childhoods argues that middle-class parents engage in what I call concerted cultivation, the systematic and deliberate effort to develop children's talents and skills at every conceivable moment. And working-class parents, you know, love their kids very much, but use scarce resources to take care of them, but presume that they'll spontaneously grow and thrive. So a lot of people who have dogs came up to me and said the same thing happens with dog ownership. And that middle-class people reason with their dogs. We won't go out yet. Just, can you stay patient for a second? Okay, we'll go soon. You're being such a good dog. Okay, can you do this for me? Okay, great. And working class parents, they say, give directives. Cut it out, don't do that, stop, you know? And so, you know, I always thought that would be a great study. So he started going to dog parks and watching dogs and you know, there were some differences in what he noticed. And so immediately multiple directions presented themselves. So one was, he interviewed some people, and one was from a working class home and one was from a middle class home, and they argued about how to take care of the dog. And the middle class person wanted to be more lenient and more, you know, the working class was more directive. And this created strain in their marriage. Yeah. A second point was that he was living in sort of a gentrifying neighborhood that was predominantly Black. He's a white guy. And he lived there for a good while. But then when he was walking around with this dog that they were fostering, he began to get hostility from some of the members in the community, especially, a Black man was driving by and when the car was yelling at him. And so it was like a flashpoint for racial tension. And there was some literature on that. Another way was that he was actually working full-time in a homeless shelter. And, there was all this emphasis on dogs and getting fresh air and exercise, the dog whisperer, all this stuff. And in this homeless shelter, the mom and the kids were in very small rooms, like maybe half the size of this room here. And there wasn't anything about kids had a right to exercise and fresh air, and that they had a duty and to have that. So he was interested in the notion of citizenship and rights and privilege and personhood connected to pet ownership. Yeah. And then the other thing was like, what's a family? Who are the members of the family? And in Unequal Childhoods, I always asked what was the name of the if they had pets, and like the hamsters got code names, right? In Unequal Childhoods, everyone got a code name, including the hamsters. So you see here that Rob Lyons immediately faced 4 different pathways that took him into different literatures with the same data. 4 different so what questions, all of them interesting, right? And there was really no one right way to do this. So it was really up to him and what he found interesting. But once he decided, he needed to decide pretty soon because it affected what kind of data he collected, who he interviewed, what he looked for in his field notes. So I didn't think it was reasonable for him to know this before he started. But then by a quarter, third, by the way through the project, I wanted him to sort of figure out what his priorities were, And for him, it was the personhood and citizenship idea was the key idea. So that in data analysis, you want to both go deep and then you want to it should be stepping back. Sometimes you can do a table, an Excel file, and you can have ideas and all the people, and you can have little quotes in there. You want to do that through data collection and then you're doing after data collection. So you're just trying to figure it out. And so my rule of thumb, by the time people are halfway through, they should be making significant progress to narrowing their focus. And they should be clear on their contribution to the literature and how their project contributes. And by the time they're 2/3 of the way through, they should have a pretty clear critique of the field, a pretty clear thesis, and an account of how it advances the literature. It won't be perfect, it might change. And so the idea is to take this case as a springboard to answer broader questions. And so that means that people need to think as they go. And that's super hard to do when you're collecting data because you're racing to get interviews or you're getting field notes and you're rolling the field. And if they're accepting you or not, you're writing field notes like hour after hour after hour. And just to pause and to think is a lot harder than it would seem. So signing up to give talks, I'm in a writing group where we meet every 3 weeks, which is fantastic. They give me a lot of good advice. Writing memos, reading papers, getting feedback. And when I was writing Unequal Childhoods, I gave a talk. I went to UC San Diego. They had loved my first book, Home Advantage. It was a very friendly audience, and I just got hammered. I said, this is a deficit model. This is a culture of poverty. And I felt like, and they're like, right? So I was like, okay, I need to do better. So then I changed it. You'll notice, for example, if you read Unequal Childhoods, there's a lot of criticism of middle-class kids. They're so exhausted. There's a lot of, they don't get along with each other, and not much on the working class families. They watch TV unlimited, so the idea is middle-class readers are going to criticize working class families, and anyways, gradually I stopped getting that kind of feedback. And so then I'm like, okay. that I felt like I could publish it. So I think, how can faculty be helpful and unhelpful? I think there are very useful questions. What troubles you about existing studies? What studies do you admire? And then you want to take notes of what people tell you. Sometimes you can take notes of what students tell me, then reorder it to make it clearer, and then tell them back what they just told you in a slightly more eloquent form. So I think, I admire quantitative work, but I think many concerns are not particularly relevant for qualitative researchers. So when I was a lot younger, I used to get panic when people would say, with such a small sample, how do you know your results are representative? And I would panic. Doesn't it change how you're there? Don't your results vary a lot by when you go and who you interview? Are the results unreliable? Can't you, And so in the book, Unequal Listening to People, I put stock answers here. Or who asks, I say the same thing. My study seeks to go deeper and understand the meaning of events. The goal is not to generalize. I'm trying to improve the understanding of key social processes. I focus on unpacking factors that matter, processes missed by other studies, right? And so, I just don't think we should worry about these questions because they're not really that appropriate for the method. And there's just no good answer, And so, May 1,000 flowers. And there's been sort of a small army of the most controversial and heavily scrutinized aspect of unequal childhoods is that, and that's, for example, the white and Black middle-class families have they lived in racially segregated neighborhoods. Their dads had discrimination at work and on the street. Race mattered in crucial ways. Multiracially, their parents wanted a positive racial identity for their kids. Absolutely. But in what I was looking at, organized activities, reasoning, language use, and intervention institutions, there was a lot of similarity between the white and Black kids, and a huge difference between the Black middle-class kids and working class and poor Black kids. So a lot of people have, worked pretty hard to show that I was wrong on this. And, I think the results, I think there's a book by Don Dow called Mothering All Black. I think it's a good book. And I think it makes some useful modifications, saying that the moms think about this 24/7. But for the most part, I think the results have held up. There are a lot of studies and they show pretty big class differences in how kids spend their time. So it's not one study, it's a bunch of studies, like May 1,000 flowers bloom. So I think there are unhelpful questions or concerns people can ask. And I think there are questions that are helpful for mentors to ask. And finally, their mistakes are inevitable. We all make mistakes in life. We all make mistakes in research, but most are not consequential. And the best studies are done by young people, And so I think there are things that faculty and mentors can do and to help ensure high quality work, helping people focus, helping people to figure out what their priorities are. And but I think there are differences in how faculty can help people by method. And the emergent character conflicts with milestones. And so I think we all do the best we can in saying what we think we can do. I think it's reasonable to ask people to write a dissertation proposal when they really don't know what they're doing, because you want to know, can you summarize the literature coherently? Can you do your best effort to make a criticism of literature and state a research question, even though that's going to change? So I think it's a reasonable expectation, but then I think we have to be flexible as it goes along. So just to sum up, I think I've talked about design having hard choices and being systematic and rigorous in the design, about deep data and precise claims, and gaining clarity on your contribution, And so that the effort is to be systematically rigorous, which means there are paths you do not take. And you have to give up on a lot of things, but that the research is emergent. And you find out what you're doing as you do it. And hopefully by the end, you have a clear plan. So thank you very much.